Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled that you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've got busy lives, so we really appreciate the time that you're taking to be here. My name's Nicole Kraft, and I am the co-director of the Sports and Society Initiative here at Ohio State. And our mission is really to examine how sport and society intersect with one another and to help foster an understanding of that through research, through events that we hold twice a year, our next one being April 19th, when we look at the intersection of professionalization and youth sports. And when we think about people who reflect kind of that intersection of sport and society and the ways in which they impact one another, Lawrence Funderburke's name certainly is premier in our minds, and we hope that he's premier in yours. So through his involvement in professional sports, collegiate sports, professional sports, and then through the activism and the really the economic awareness that he's brought to sports subsequent to his career, he's really kind of changed the perception of how athletes need to move past their professional years and how students in general need to be looking at their own economic well-being. So we're going to talk today, but this is a really informal conversation. These SSI huddles we hold once a month. This is the biggest one we've held, so we're super excited you're here. But our goal is really to bring someone who has significance and prominence in the sport and society industry and environment, and bring them to a level where the rest of us get to hear from them, but get to interact with them much more personally. So this is a conversation not between Lawrence and myself, but between all of us. So we very much want for your questions. We want you to voice your opinions and your thoughts, and we're going to open that up repeatedly for you to be able to do that. So I hope you're thinking of questions as we talk a little bit. I also would be remiss if I didn't show you Lawrence's book, which I hope he'll sign for me before he leaves. And this book, Socio-Psychoeconomics, I have been reading it ever since he sent it to me. I cannot recommend highly enough that you check this out. If you want to try to understand more about how we perceive of, how wealth and really personal awareness and your status in society all intersect with one another, and how your brain development impacts all of that. I mean, it's a really complex and really impressive book. So I hope that you guys will check it out. Lawrence has given us special pricing. We're actually going to do a random drawing with some trivia for 5 copies that the Sports and Society Initiative has been able to purchase, so that we will be able to share this book with all of you. So I look forward to getting started.
Thank you.
Can we have a big round of applause and welcome Lawrence, please?
Thank you.
Is your chair too low?
No, it's okay.
Chair?
I'm okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I hope everyone knows your story, but I'm not sure that everyone does. So I was hoping that you might be able to take a minute and just kind of share with us how you got to be sitting here today.
First of all, thank you for your introduction. I got to put you on the payroll because that was fantastic. Wow, that was awesome. Just like a lot of athletes, I grew up in a very difficult, a very dysfunctional environment. I grew up here in Columbus, Ohio, on the west side, Sullivan Gardens Housing Project, which was considered probably the roughest, toughest, the baddest, the meanest housing project in the city. I grew up where the expectations were very low, particularly as an African American, a poor kid. Not much was expected of me. I grew up without a father, never knew my father, never saw my father more than 3 times, and he never once told me that he loved me. You grow up with a lot of anger, a lot of rage, and it's really very tragic, because if you don't know how to channel that, you're going to have a lot of problems. For me, fortunately, it was, the 3 B's I focused on was the Bible, books, academics, and basketball. Those were the 3 things that kind of, my protective factors that kind of keep me in play, so to speak. So that's kind of in a nutshell my story a little bit.
So how do you come to Ohio State? Walk us through kind of that pathway to get here and the experiences that you had here that helped shape who you became.
Well, originally I signed out of high school with a coach by the name of Bobby Knight. I was talking to Charlie Wilson here. He had some interesting comments about Bobby Knight. That didn't go over too well. And he said it's going to be my way or the highway. So I think I chose the highway. When you're a big-time athlete, one of the top 5 players coming out of high school, expectations are so high. Mm-hmm. And I think when you lose perspective in terms of being grounded, you run into a lot of problems. And I chose to play with Indiana. Obviously, wasn't a good fit for me. Mm-hmm. And then coming back here, playing for Coach Ayers, Randy Ayers was my coach, a great coach, really a player's coach. And I think he was someone who really understood me. And I think particularly for a lot of guys, particularly African Americans, when you don't have fathers, you kind of want to gravitate to a person like that. So he certainly helped fill that void, and it's been a great experience, not just graduating from Ohio State, but also getting a chance to interact and meet people long after my playing days is an unbelievable feeling.
And then, you know, all of us, I think when we played basketball in the driveway, we dreamed that we'd hit the last second shot or we'd be in the NBA, and you managed to get there. How does that transition happen, both physically and mentally, to go from being a top-tier collegiate athlete to being a pro player?
You know, I always get asked all the time, how did you make it? How did you get out? And for me, everything's about planning, right? I'm an obsessive planner. I know my wife's like, yep, that's him. He's telling on himself. I always had a goal and a vision to get out of the neighborhood, you know, and to get out of that box. The box couldn't contain me. And I think for a lot of athletes, and I really challenge athletes all the time, particularly inner city African-American athletes, don't just allow people to put you in a box as an athlete. Be an intellectual. And I think when you are that, then people will respect you more. Yes, you're going to have some problems because people are not going to know how to read you and decipher what you're trying to say, but I think people will respect you. And I think that's the most important thing, because when I come across people, they say you were someone who always had very strong opinions. We may not always agree with them, but yet you were someone who had a position where it made you think. And I think with me, I always want people to actually think about what I say. Whether they agree with it or not, they're certainly going to think about it.
You know, we use the term here and in a lot of collegiate environments of revenue athletes, which seems to really kind of resonate exactly with the messaging that you're bringing out. What kind of stigmatization do we put or branding do we put on an athlete when we call she or he a revenue athlete versus, and now we call them Olympic athletes?
Well, you're a commodity. You know, the commoditization of athletics has taken on a whole new thing. I mean, I played 20-some years ago. I mean, it's totally different today. I mean, the revenue generators. And I think we're in a tough situation because they've got to find a way, particularly at some of the big-time athletic schools like Ohio State, how can we empower these athletes? Above and beyond their time here at the university, how can you help them long after their playing days? Because so many athletes really struggle with the transition. And when all you do is see yourself as an athlete, you're going to struggle, you know, when it comes to real life. And I think we owe it, it's incumbent upon us to do more for our athletes than to just give them a scholarship. We have to empower them and give them life skills that can transcend and really legacy skills. That's really the way I look at it.
So the stories of you are legendary, of how frugal you were when you were playing professional basketball. Can you describe for us, tell some of those stories of kind of how you kept yourself grounded when the money was at its peak?
Well, you know, I keep a food stamp in my pocket, welfare, because I never want to be disconnected from that experience, and because you know you're always haunted by that, and I think you know that fear sometimes of being poor has been a driving factor with me, and understanding that writing a book like this is I've been there in terms of being poor. I live sort of functional income stability American lifestyle, which would be the middle class, and then obviously being around affluent people and being in affluence, you learn so much. But just being grounded is really comfort, because I think whenever you become disconnected from your experience and your past, then you know you need a reality check. And being frugal, my kids say I'm cheap. Daddy, you're so cheap. You know, you're so cheap. But I think thriftiness is something that we all can be better at, and I think consumerism in America has really been very problematic, you know, because people are so attached to things as opposed to relationships, and I think I've always wanted to be more in tune with relationships than things.
How did you, when you were faced with the opportunity to have the wealth of being a professional athlete? I mean, you look at the Sean Kemp story. I worked in the NBA. I worked with a player named Sedale Threatt who went to jail for not paying child support. They make some decisions that seem out of the realm of normality because it's not a normal lifestyle. So when you were in that environment, how did you decide how you were going to behave, and how did you try to model that for other people? Well,
you know, I say for particularly basketball, eventually the basketball is going to stop bouncing. And when your air goes out, what are you going to do with your life? Nobody really cares about you unless you're Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, somebody pretty famous. Who really cares? So you have to have a life plan, a transition plan. And I think, you know, Gail Ayers said it best. He said athletes should think about the end of their career at the beginning of their career. And I always said you should have kind of a game plan on what you want to do in life after basketball. And I think when you come into money, if you have reckless habits coming into it, eventually it's just going to be a matter of time. So I think for a lot of athletes, you know, particularly who grew up very poor, no one ever talked to them about the value of a dollar or saving or investing. And I think it's very troubling because it's not just at the MBA level or at the college level. This should start much earlier. It should be even at the middle school or elementary level, teaching people the connection between money and emotions. Because when you're very emotional, then you have problems like this. So it's not surprising, and I think we all can be better in terms of being stewards over the things that we've been entrusted to care for.
You guys have questions for Lawrence? I have like 8,000 of them, so I could keep going, but does anyone have any thoughts on this topic that you might want to share with us or jump in with? All right, we'll keep going then. So I definitely want to talk about this book, and I want to talk about the title of it. What does socio-psychoeconomics mean? Where did you come up with that? And what does it mean in general, and what does it mean to you?
Right, yeah, so, socio-psychoeconomics, it's a big word. I know Clark Kellogg said it was one of his platinum level words. It merges sociology, psychology, and economics. And I think that the key is the psychological component, because most people think of socioeconomics, but they never really bring into play the psychological aspect. I mean, everything we do obviously has a psychological component, but my question was really not what people do, but I want to know why. Why do they do them? Why do they engage in those types of behaviors? I know I was always a very inquisitive person, and if you didn't give me a satisfactory answer, I would continue to ask until I got that. And I think I wanted to demystify, in terms of social classes, but to say, who are people? Because you have to put a face on poverty. What does it mean to really be poor? We see it, and a lot of us are very disconnected, because if we give, we have arm's length transaction where we give from a distance. But how do you understand that world, the dysfunction? Because most people, particularly if you grew up in the middle class or affluence, it doesn't make sense. So how do you kind of understand what they go through on a day-to-day basis? And then the middle class, obviously, they're probably in the biggest trouble because they're not poor enough to receive government support, and they don't have the assets to be able to immunize themselves from financial calamity. So the book was written mainly for them. I consider myself someone who's really at peace in terms of the middle class, because I love their grit, I love their determination in what they do. But I always say that if you're middle class, you can have a middle class job, but you have to have a wealth building mentality. And I think that's something that I've really tried to highlight in the book. And then for the affluent, most people think that their life is just carefree. They have a lot of challenges. I mean, particularly the mega affluent, people think it's just, money's not an issue, but certainly legacy continuation. Obviously, there are always threats, so everyone has challenges. I think this book really lays it out in terms of what each class goes through, because I think when you're able to articulate and explain what each class goes through, you're better able to understand as opposed to making assumptions. And I don't really like assumptions. I want to know really what people and why people do what they do.
And how does race interplay within this? Because we certainly, it's one thing to say we don't understand poverty, but then when you add racial components to it, then we really don't understand. And we put a lot of stigmatization on people based on what we think we see or what we perceive. What's your take on that?
Growing up poor, obviously being an African American, a lot of times, particularly at a big time university like this, a lot of kids only look at being a professional athlete or being a rapper or being an entertainer or hitting a lottery or some trampoline effect where they can bounce out of their situation to get out, as opposed to seeing you can be a lawyer, you can be a financial advisor, you can be an educator. There are so many different paths, but when you're not exposed to that, then how are you going to aspire for it? I always say, in order to taste success, you got to see it. And I think that is a very important thing. And I think the gap's getting wider and wider and wider in our country. And I think it's time for us to really start doing something, not necessarily looking at government or some type of system, but we have to really make a change at a grassroots level. And I think that's what I want to do. Not Democrat, not Republican. This is our country. And we're responsible for stewarding and particularly helping the next generation become successful, because a lot of them particularly don't think so. And I think, whenever I talk to college students, I'm always probing them, what do you want to do with your life? How are you? And a lot of them, are a little bit unsure, but, what they're going to have to make some of these changes, and they're going to be responsible for some of the solutions and stuff. And money is going to be a critical factor in that equation.
You talk in here about ROI, which I found really interesting, because teaching college students, I sense a fear of failure. And I mean, none of us want to fail, but I often feel like college students now don't feel like they're allowed to fail. In going through their K-12, every test they take is going to determine their future, and if they blow any of that, life as they know it is over. They don't get into the right college. It's this kind of upward domino effect. So from your perspective, what kind of ROI should they be focusing on?
Well, my biggest thing, particularly with young folks, I've got a teenagers who's not too far from college students, and getting them to really focus on their personal brand. And understanding that some of the best learning experiences of my life have been times of failure. And learning from that, because I think you got to get a dose of humility, and sometimes you got to be humiliated in order to get that. And I think for young people, helping them understand that labels, and then when they put too much pressure on themselves, I think it sets them up for a time where they don't really learn from some of those critical mistakes that they need, right? So when you don't make those mistakes and you're so cautious, you don't take risks. And when you don't take risks, then you don't grow. And I think that's something, and I think the amazing thing is, particularly a lot of the parents, a lot of them have been helicopter parents. Everything that evolved, I know you're laughing there.
Anybody back here? Anybody want to raise their hand on that one?
And they hover over their kids and everything, and we didn't grow up that way, So you got to allow kids. I mean, little Johnny's playing on the tree. Well, he might get hurt. Look, we climb trees all the time, and we're okay. Yeah, sometimes, yeah. So I think parents have tried to control, and they need to cut the umbilical cord of particularly mothers in terms of the relationship with their kids.
Wait a minute, you're looking right at me.
I'm sorry.
I'll accept that.
And it is, you have to. And my mom was like, look, boy, she was just like, you got to learn from your mistakes. Yeah. And I think when we protect young people too much, we don't allow them to grow. And I think we've been too protective of this generation, particularly millennials or Generation Z, however you want to label them.
Questions, guys? Yes.
When I was a young girl coming out of Appalachia, I was sometimes victimized by what they call the imposter syndrome, where someone would find out that I didn't really belong where I was, that I hadn't earned the right to be there. As you were growing up, were you ever victimized by that imposter syndrome?
Lawrence Funderburke, I've always been comfortable with Pookie and Ray Ray and them in the hood, or Mary and John Thomas in the middle class, or the Hofsteins in affluence. I've never really changed who I was depending on the person. And I think it's very, that is very prevalent. Even my wife, I talk about in the book, who grew up in Chillicothe, Ohio. She grew up in Appalachia, and she was always very uncomfortable being around people who were very poor, in terms of growing up how I grew up, and then also being around very mega affluent people where you feel like you don't really belong. And I think, the thing is, when you perceive people to be higher than you, then you defer to them. And then that can be a very dangerous thing. But I think that phenomenon is very, very much alive and well. If you read the book Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance, he talks a little bit about that environment. And it can be, I always say that the first time when I was around mega affluent people, it was kind of like the first time I played against Michael Jordan. And it's like you get lightheaded and it's like, whoa, where am I, And then you're in this environment and you see and you say, man, how much power and influence it is. And I think it can be very overwhelming. I think in our society is when you write a book like this, it's very important to understand folks, so that way people don't make judgments about if you grew up poor or Appalachian that you're less than. You're a human being and you should be treated as such. And I think that's something that I've always conveyed. I've never treated wealthy people or middle class or poor people any different. I treat everybody the same. And I know my wife can attest to that. And I think everybody deserves to be treated like equal in terms of their humanness.
Absolutely. Other questions? Yeah, Eric.
Lawrence, how do we expose this next generation of young people to this area of sports culture? So you look at the dynamics, be it from a gender or race standpoint, but there are a lot of black males, for example, who are general managers of NBA teams that a lot of students don't know. Who who the owners are. Can you talk a bit about that level of exposure and how often that should happen, because everything's not always on Sports Center.
Right.
See the business side
Right.
of sports, and to
Right.
really educate and expose our young people on college campuses. There's a career in sports, but
Right.
I know the track I want to go, but I need to see somebody who looks like me
Right.
in those positions other than just playing the sport itself. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think it really comes to the messaging. Because we glorify athletes, Sports Center, and then kids gravitate to that. And they don't think that you don't have to be the show to be a part of it, right? You can be behind the scenes and still be successful. And I think getting young people to understand, particularly African Americans, that if you want to go into sports, there are many different avenues. And then a lot of them think if they don't make it in sports, then their life is over with. And I think, again, it's having a very narrow-minded tunnel vision. But again, that's all of us are to blame because, you know, when you have a messaging problem, you're going to have issues like this. And particularly with social media, it seems it would be better, but it's actually not. It's worse now because it's so hyper-focused on celebrity status. You don't really see what does success really look like. And I think that's what you're saying. Success should be something that is attainable for all people, and you got to see people in different capacities in order to aspire for it. So I think that's a great question. Hopefully I kind of answer that a little bit. I know that's a deep. You're a deep brother, man. You always probing me, and I just wish more African American kids can be more holistic in terms of what opportunities look like. Not just think they're in a narrow box. And a lot of them, when they realize that sports is not going to be their ticket out of the ghetto, they kind of give up on life. And you see that all the time. And you see that a lot in big time universities. You know, we had a discussion about this, about should college athletes be paid. And it's something that we're going to have to really tackle and really deal with.
Chris?
Thanks for being here, Lawrence. Really appreciate it. I haven't read the book. I'm not very familiar with it. I don't know how much it's focused on sport issues per se versus, you know, how people process and experience their life. I was going to save this question towards the end as it's kind of a segue to our spring panel here, but based on the previous question, I thought I may as well pose it. As you're talking about socioeconomics, I'm thinking, oh, that sounds like the perfect term to use to start thinking about how parents try to make sense of a culture of youth sports that is becoming increasingly professionalized, where you're talking about cultural pressures about, you know, what you do for your kid, where you're thinking about structural organizations that are in place, you're thinking about the psychological processes, about how other people might think of you, or, you know, what's important, the economic resources, right? From this standpoint, and sort of as a preview for what we'll be talking about in the spring, either based on your experiences or your notions of the youth sports industry, you know, how do your insights about socioeconomics apply to how parents should try to navigate the professionalization of youth sports?
You know, I think this is, I think a lot of parents are looking at it as an investment, that if I get professional or get lessons for my child or put them in AAU, travel sports, then it's going to improve their chances, not only getting a college scholarship, but also playing at the professional level. You know, I grew up in an era where AAU was just kind of going up, and, I had people who would take me around, they give me a little bit of food, they give me some shoes, and it was like they had their own agenda. You understand what I'm saying? So I got very guarded, and I was a very open person, and then obviously when people take advantage of you start to be very sheltered. And I think we really need to see and understand that, you know, AAU unfortunately is the beast is going to continue to grow. I think the issue is how can we incorporate some life skills, because not every kid is going to play professional basketball, and you particularly see the kids who are most damaged, inner city black kids, right? Let's be honest about this. And it's very unfortunate because when their talent is exhausted or it doesn't materialize at a big time level, these kids are discarded. And we don't really care about them. And I think that is a very troubling thing that we see. And I think AAU, I mean, you look at the situation with Louisville, you look at all of these things, all these different scandals. I mean, these are things that are only that make the public. But these things go on. They've been going on for quite some time. And the gatekeepers are doing a lot of damage. And particularly when you have a single parent mom, like my mom was, who's she going to trust? She's going to see who's going to give her some money or who's going to offer this or that and tell her what she wants to hear. She's not necessarily thinking, for many of them, you know, that my son, I'm more concerned about the character development of my son than I am about him being able to shoot a jump shot. So I think we really need to revisit what AAU is about, the importance of it, and what the obligation is to help these kids from a holistic perspective. And that it starts there. You're right, it does start there, because once it starts there and they get to college, it's just a snowball effect, you know. So we're going to continue to see, kids basically be pushed through a system like they're commodities, slaves, if you will. The highest bidder is going to get the talent. I think that's a big problem.
Yes, and
Go back in time.
we'll get you in a second. No, go ahead. You're fine. No, we'll go back.
If you
could go back in time and ask, give a piece of advice to your 18, 19, or 20-year-old self, what would it be?
I know my wife's like, she's looking at me like, we on Ohio State campus too, right? Protecting my brand, because I think when you're very negligent with your brand, you always pay a cost. So I assumed that I was going to be a lottery pick. And when it came time to be drafted, I had an NBA executive. He told me, he said, Lawrence, everybody knows you have lottery talent, but nobody's going to draft you in a lottery because they can't trust your brand. And I couldn't blame my coaches. I couldn't blame my teammates. I couldn't blame anyone. Your brand is your responsibility, and you have to guard it with religious fervor. And I wish I wouldn't have been as reckless and carefree as I was with my personal brand, because people perceive you. I'm 47 now. People still remember how I was 25 years ago, and they still hold on to that image of Lawrence Funderburke. Probably just being more guarded with my personal brand. And I think I'm glad that we didn't have social media back then, right? Yeah. I'm glad. I thank the Lord.
I thank God every day it wasn't
right?
there when I was in college.
You know, so that's something that I really regret. And obviously, as a man of faith who loves the Lord, just a lot of the things that I did that were very, very troubling. I regret a lot of those things, and particularly when it comes to your personal brand. As you're a young person, I know I got a chance to talk to you about some of your career goals. Protect your brand. That's all you have, you know. And you know, social media is something that a lot of young people don't pay much attention to. And when it's out there,
they pay
it's
all
permanent.
their attention
or they
to
pay
it.
all their attention to.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm talking about pay
No, I know
attention
what
to
you're
in
saying.
terms of how protective it is and what they need to do.
In the back?
Yes, I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I became a teacher, counselor, coach. And, you know, high school kids are my background, you know. The question I have, do you feel like kids today give up when things start to get tough? That didn't happen in my day. And I don't know about your time, you came after me, but, you know, do you find that that's a true situation today?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you think about the structure of particularly in our community, African American community, you had, you know, lawyers and doctors in the community, and you think about once they left, you think about who replaced that void. Obviously, it wasn't necessarily beneficial, and I think the mentoring and I think having that village mentality has been lost in our culture, particularly in our community, and we got to get that back. We got to have a culture where we really think about really how can I really help this child? Not what can I get from him, but how can I help him? And I think it's everybody's responsibility. And I think that village mentality of really looking out after each other's kids, and I think we've gotten away from that. Now you can't say anything to anybody's kid, right? Why are you doing this to my kid? Don't talk to my kid that way. Right. And I think we've lost sight of that. And I think it does, the principles and the characteristics in terms of the struggle back then, you know, a lot of kids think of that as that's, you know, archaic. That was so long ago, it doesn't apply. But principles are principles. And I think when our kids don't have a set of principles or a set of values, they're left to their own impulses. And that's why we see a lot of the behavior today where kids are having a sag. That drives me crazy, right? They just have a total disregard in terms of etiquette and how you should conduct yourself. And I always say it's not about being white. It's about being right. It's about a proper way to conduct yourself as a human being. Nobody's asking you to give up your identity as an African American, but I think you should think about decorum and etiquette and what it means to be a person of character. I think we've gotten totally away from what character really is. Churches, I think they've been very negligent and not really helping our young people. There's such a disconnect between the older generation and the younger generation. And that's even a whole nother issue that's really part and parcel of this discussion on athletics and why most of our athletes are very reckless in terms of their personal brand.
You know, it gets into
You're next.
that, let's say an individual's, you know, teenager can have a great deal of support, but when he's out there under that one or two, you know, experiences where he's got to show a certain toughness and maybe a few other qualities, intelligence, decision making, and all that, do they still, what is it inside of them that makes them feel like, I can't do this?
Right. It's your values. You know, your values are your guiding principles that shape your daily decisions, actions, and activities. As a certified financial planner, I start there. I think when people have not assessed their values, then the whims of life can take you anywhere. And I think values are something that's an old school mentality, but you got to have a certain sense of values that are going to sustain you no matter what goes on, right? Absolutely. Whether it's sports, whether it's business, whether it's parenting, you have to have values. Values stand the test of time. And I think we need to go back to some old school modeling when it comes to what we need to do to help our society, because it's out of control, right? It's not just sports. This is symptomatic of where our society is in terms of what's disseminated politically out there. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just, where's the civility? And then the kids today, they see that and they model that. So when you get me started, I'm never bashful about expressing my opinions.
That's good.
What
That's
you
why
see is
you're
what
here.
you get with Lawrence. You might not like what I say, but you're going to understand what I mean.
Zach?
Going back to personal branding, there are a lot of examples of how people will hurt it through social media. How do you think people can really help their personal brand through their use of social media?
Well, I think first of all, I always say if you can put your phone down or social media for 1 week and not pick it up, that should be a lesson in being reserved and making sure you're under control. And I think for your personal brand, particularly social media, I'm not going to bash this generation, because if we had this, we probably would have some of the same issues. I think it's unfair to judge today's generation with that. I think when it comes to social media is being very careful and mindful of what you're putting out there. I think that's the big thing. And understanding that everything doesn't have to be impulsive. Just because someone comments, you don't have to reply back. I think learning to say no. And I think particularly when it comes to personal branding, I see a lot of young people today, they're always involved in shortcuts, acronyms. But I think in terms of your intellect and being able to express yourself, never cut corners in terms of who you want to be. Don't cut corners in terms of your social media profile, because that's what people see. Your public and your private. And I always say if there's a disconnect between your public and your private persona, there's an issue there. Mm-hmm. You have to address that. And I think for young people today, they're very reckless in terms of their social media profile, because they're always wanting to fit in. And when you want to fit in, you'll do anything in order to get the likes. I see that all the time, likes. I'm like, I don't care who likes me. I mean, that's how I was at all. It doesn't matter if you like me or not. But it's a different generation. Today, likes and being included and being cool is what it is. Like the kid, Zion Williamson, a basketball player, is going to Duke. I saw like 1 million people follow. I was like, wow, But it's a different era today, and that's what your generation is. I think sometimes learning how to turn it off, turn your phone off, right? You don't have to respond to every text or every post. And if you do that, trust me, it will help you down the road.
People can say some really nasty stuff on Twitter and stuff.
They can.
But, how do you think you would have responded? Let's say you had a bad day and social media was around back then, and people just saying really hurtful things.
Well, I was a pretty combative person. If you elbow me, I'm going to hit you twice as hard. So I think learning to restrain yourself and not be enticed into that debate is very tough. It's very challenging, because people can say very hurtful, very nasty things. And I think when you come back and be very combative, you play right into their hands. And it does. It really comes back to restraining yourself, and it's very hard. But again, if your identity is attached to social media, they're going to control you. Right? They're going to control you, and it's going to be like a puppet master. They're going to control you. But if you say, you know what, that's just your opinion, it's not a fact, you're able to walk away from that. I think it's good. It's tough. I think we have a cross section of ages here, and it's very difficult. It's easy for us who didn't grow up in that era to say, don't do this, but you're bombarded with those messages every day, and to respond, it's very tough. And having a short-sighted mentality in terms of being controlled by the information, that's something that you have to learn patience, and learning restraint, I think, is a very hard thing to learn. I'd rather learn it when I'm younger than when I'm older. Wouldn't you agree, those who are a little older, right?
Those are a little older. You look right at you, Eric. Yes, sir.
We're talking about role models. So, you said that we put professional athletes on the pedestal sometimes. And does a professional athlete, do they have an option to opt out of being a role model?
That's a great question. I struggle with this. My wife is here, and I had kind of a questionable off-the-court persona, because I never really wanted to be a role model, but I had no choice. Charles Barkley, remember the commercial, I'm not a role model. Remember that commercial? If you look it up, young people,
God,
you
he
can
was
see
abused
that.
over that.
Yeah, and I think you are a role model. And it was tough for me because, you know, when your lifestyle is such that's this reckless, it's hard for you to be a role model. And I think so many athletes today fight that. They resist what it means to be a role model because it's, you know, there's a certain standard that you have to hold up to in order to be a role model. It was very difficult for me. I really struggled with that because I felt like my private life was my private life and that it should be separated. And, you know, I had a hard time interacting with people, particularly if you came to me on a sports level, not on an intellectual level, I would give you a Heisman stiff arm. But if you approach me from an intellectual perspective, I would talk to you, you know. And I think, again, when you're branded an athlete and people see you just in that capacity, it's easy to kind of be labeled that and to understand that being a role model it comes with the territory. It's not optional. And I think I see Dave Egelhoff, who's director of basketball ops here for Ohio State. We had a tough loss yesterday off the glass there. And I think Ohio State really talks to their athletes about what it means. Again, it comes to the individual level in terms of the kid. But again, if there are deficits with character when you get to college, it's kind of hard for a university to make amends and to cover all those deficits. You know, again, it goes way, way back. But again, it's symptomatic of where we are in terms of our culture. It's not just at a big time level. This goes way, way back, you know, to pushing kids through school who really, I mean, most of the kids they can't read, they can't talk, they can't, there's no analytical skills, and then yet they get to college and, you know, we have these deficits. So we gotta deal with that. So role modeling is not just for athletes. I think as parents, as individuals in this community, we need to understand what it means to be a role model ourselves. Sometimes we cast the spotlight too much on athletes, but we gotta stop and think, what am I doing in my own space to be a role model? I think that's really the bigger issue.
I mean, it does seem like, and I'd love your take on this, that as a society, we've put the responsibility on external forces as opposed to internal. Mm-hmm. And, you know, as parents, it seems like we're willing to let other people model for us, and that's where we end up with Oprah Winfrey being the prime candidate for president because she's Oprah Winfrey, not because she may be qualified. And the same idea, I think we turn things over onto our sports figures because we're looking for something. We're desperately seeking that. My husband's a teacher, and he says, you realize that of our professions, you're a journalist and I'm a teacher, and we're two of the least respected people that we know from a professional standpoint, and look what we're trying to accomplish. So how do you reconcile those things? You know, I mean, as a parent, you can model so much, but moving forward with the kids that we're trying to influence at the K-12 level, at the college level, how do we engage them in meaningful role models and to help them become role models themselves?
I mean, it's a difficult challenge because you're asking educators now. My role models were never sports figures. Mm-hmm. They were my teachers. I had a close relationship with all of my teachers. Still to this day, I talk to my teachers because they had that much of an impact on me. And they said, Lawrence, you can be, I had a teacher, my third grade teacher, Ms. John, she said, Lawrence, you can be anything. And if you're focused, and I always appreciated what she said because what she said was genuine. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to really take a look back and what is our obligation to help these kids long term, not just get from one grade to the next, but long term. And I think our kids today, particularly in the inner city, the gap's getting wider and wider and wider, even though technology and everything is advancing, but the deficit's getting more pronounced. And I think parents, particularly, you have young parents parenting kids, and that's a problem because they need role models. And then now we're asking our teachers to fix all these deficits and stuff. And again, you have churches, which is, I really call them out. You have nonprofit organizations. You have all these other entities that should be stepping forward to help with a lot of these things. And I think it takes concerned individuals to really step forward and to say enough is enough. We have to help our kids, whether they play sports or not. They're going to be productive members of society. It's a trite expression, but it's certainly something that we should all be aiming for when it comes to our kids.
Yes.
So I know one of the largest issues right now in college basketball and kind of sports is the whole like one and done rule for leaving school early. And I know you, I think you can attest that you made like the right decision to go to college. But do you think that players should be forced to go to college for 4 years, or do you think that they should kind of get to choose whether they think about like the end of their careers at the beginning?
Right. Well, the longer I stayed in college, the more it hurt me in terms of financially. But my large goal was really about getting my degree, because I knew that was going to be more important, in long term, because basketball is just a short, finite period. I think I don't like the one and done rule. I think it should be 2 years at least, because 1 year is not enough to really grow up, to really mature. I think it should be 2 years, or none, because having one, I think it messes up the chemistry in terms of recruiting and all that. It's very problematic, and I think we've got to. That time will come. I think we've got to really assess, what we really want to do in terms of helping our kids. But at the same time, people make the argument, if someone creates an app or something, they're 18, like Facebook, should they be able to go right to the pros? I mean, so that's a very valid situation. But I think when it comes to today's athletes, we've got to really assess that. And I think it's something that they keep going back and forth for. And should it be 1? Should it be 2? Should it be 3? I like football. It is 3, because you grow up and you think about football players and basketball. You see they're more mature, and I think, it's just a different. It's just a different thing. And I think a lot of that has to do with just growing and learning, and then finding yourself as you go through these years. Sometimes 1 year it may not be long enough to really find who you are as a person. So it's tough. It's a tough situation when you got someone who's poor, and your whole family is dependent on you to take care of you. You're the lottery ticket. It's tough. It's tough. I mean, you're thinking, what's the quickest route that I can help my family? So, every situation is different, but I think we still can try to see how can we help these kids above and beyond their time. I think that's the key, is what's our obligation to help these young athletes above and beyond their time on a hardwood, on a gridiron, or whatever the case may be.
I mean, we can talk about societally the focus on wealth and prioritization of your values, but the fact is college is more expensive than ever, and if you are not an athlete, it's very difficult for you to get to a level like you are. And if you are not, don't have the financial wherewithal to send your kid to these academies that we were talking about to hopefully get them recognized, what do we say to those kids who are like, look, I can't, and to be honest, I don't have 32 to get into Ohio State. Like I can't afford it, I don't have the grades. How do we inspire them when it looks like things are not getting any easier for them and getting much more difficult?
It is. It's true. I mean, I remember when I came to Ohio State, tuition was, it was much different than it is today. And I think, I had transferred from Indiana to Ohio State, so most people don't know, I had to pay my way here at Ohio State. So I wasn't on athletic scholarship. I had to pay myself, just like, I took out the loans, Stafford loans and all that, had Pell Grants, obviously, because I was very poor. So I understand what it means. Fortunately, after I left college, I went right to the pros, so I could pay them back right away. But I tell young people today is what they've got to be cognizant of, and I always say, whatever debts you have, you're obligated to pay those back. And I think having a game plan is very important, which is what this book is about, having a financial game plan. But understanding that choosing your degree is a choice that you really need to be diligent about, because you should have a degree that's flexible, meaning it's adaptable no matter the environment is the economy is doing well or not so well, you should be able to adapt with that. And I think for young people today, many of them are overwhelmed and think, how am I ever going to get ahead? I've got $40,000 worth of debt. How am I going to make this? And I always tell people as a financial planner, I've worked with so many folks, and that if you have a game plan, if you're consistent, you're diligent, right? Sports, you have the right game plan, you would typically have more successful outcomes than not. And I think it's tough because it's increasing, 5-6% a year. Right. And a lot of young people are like, how am I going to survive once I leave college in terms of the debt? And if you don't have a game plan, you're not going to make it. It's just that simple.
I know your son was influential in your decision to write this book.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so writing this book, obviously a big inspiration was my son. My son, Eli, or our son, Eli, he was diagnosed with a condition called sensory integration disorder. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but if you ever seen anyone who has autism or ADHD or Asperger's, it's basically symptomatic of that. And obviously, he had problems in school, just a lot of anger issues, a lot of impulsive issues, just wasn't himself. And we went on the full court press to save our son without giving him any drugs and putting him in a situation where he can have a life and be functioning. We didn't care about sports. We just wanted our son to be quote unquote normal, so to speak. And he was a big inspiration. And once we start delving into the brain, and particularly the connection between the gut, your gut and your brain, this is the second brain, this is the first brain, that connection, we start saying, wow, there's a connection here in terms of what you put in your body and then how it impacts your brain. And just delving into the brain and all that, it's so fascinating. We're just scratching the surface. And this book is more of a surface perspective of the brain. It's not a neuroscience book or anything like that. It's just surface. And then we said, wow, once you start delving into this, you start seeing that these characteristics are real. And not only do they apply to social class, but they apply to really every decision that people make in life. So it's in a way, I'm almost glad that he went through that, as hard as it was for our family, because I was able to help a lot of other kids, and then also be motivated to write a book like this. So,
I mean, that's things you don't ever think about, of how the whole circle of how poverty,
right.
In terms of the quality of food that you have,
Exactly
the access
right.
to food that you have.
Right.
So what do you hope that people take from the book in terms of being able to recognize the two brains that we work with, and being able to recognize kind of the whole picture of how poverty can affect you physically, emotionally, and cognitively?
Yeah, I think, obviously the book is 37 chapters. It's kind of a textbook, but it reads just like I'm talking to you, because
great stories.
it's just stories. It's a storytelling. It's not a technical book per se. It's just more of just insightful stories and just really the game plan. I think when you assess who you are, whether you grew up poor like I did, or middle class like my wife, or affluent, you have certain habits and traits in terms of your decisions, not just financially, but how you manage your time, right? Your relationships, your network, how you look at education, all of those factors come into play based on how you were bringing. I think the beauty of being a human being, how God made us, is that we can make changes. That's the beauty of being a human being, is that you can change, right? You're not locked into it. Like they said before, the brain is locked in. You are who you are in terms of your IQ. We know now that the brain can change and you can change. And I think that's what I want this book to be about, is to make a change, and particularly all these issues that we talk about, that people talk about being a change agent, but when are you going to go out and do it?
Right.
When are you going to do it?
Absolutely.
And it starts with you. You got to change first before you can change anyone else.
No question. Yes, sir?
I have a couple of questions about issues you touch upon in your book, but first of all, with respect to one and done, or the NFL model for athletes, for football players, I would urge you to consider even more superior being the baseball model, which is that you can be drafted right out of high school, and even if you're drafted, you can negotiate and you can still decide to go to college, but if you go to college, you're locked in for 3 years. I still would like that for the basketball model.
No, I think that's a good idea.
It's a better model than the NFL model or the current NBA model of one and done. That's just an observation that I would like for you to consider, or give a reaction. But the two issues in your book that you touch upon, and one of them you touched upon earlier in your comments, your focus, and I can understand where you're coming from as a financial manager, is more on asset acquisition and retention. That's I would like to see, at least in my opinion, or I'd like to have your reaction. Why didn't you focus more upon instilling or imbuing in our children more of an entrepreneurial spirit? Because frankly, jobs are going away. The big manufacturing jobs employ lots of people that can work in a middle class or live in a middle class lifestyle. Those are the big employers now are Amazon and Walmart, and nobody can live a middle class lifestyle working at those kinds of jobs. So I guess my question is, what do you agree with that in terms of imbuing the entrepreneurial spirit's more important, and what and who can help students or children do that? And related to that to some degree is, you touch a little bit on your book on adverse childhood experiences and the impact that has on especially poor kids' brains and their ability to learn, and their cognitive abilities, and their likelihood of dropping out of school and the school to prison pipeline. My question is, which you don't really touch upon in the book, is there a role for our educational system, and in particular our public schools, to help children overcome adverse childhood experiences?
Yeah, I mean, you threw a lot at me. You know that, right?
I'm a law professor.
Yeah. And they're valid. I mean, the thing is, what I did with this book is more of a diagnosis. The sequel, there's always a sequel. I'm a compassionate capitalist, so that's going to be more of a how-to. So this is more of a diagnosis, the follow-up is going to be more of a sequel. And I think entrepreneurship is a key. It's something that I've always preached and teach. And I think my thing is entrepreneurship is important, but it's not for everybody. Not everybody's cut out to be an entrepreneur, but you can have a wealth building mentality, which is what I talk about, because I always say that you got to be able to create multiple income streams. Whether it's your job, there are other things you need to do in order to create income streams. And I do agree. I think young people today in college have more of an entrepreneurial spirit about them, but I think a lot of them are overcome by a lot of the fears, in terms of that, because the fear of failure, you talked about that, and that Silicon Valley, they cheer failure, right? Because that's when you grow. I think in terms of for inner city kids, I mean, for a lot of them, it's just teaching foundational level stuff, right? You can't teach things, starting a business when there are deficits there in terms of, relationship management, time management, educational fortitude. All of those things are very important factors that you got to really work with and address at there. So I think our public school system has to have more of a 21st century up-to-date model in terms of how we educate our kids. Unfortunately, the kind of old guard is still in play in terms of how they educating our kids today. Times have changed, which is what you're talking about, and we need to get up to speed on that. Again, you can only do so much. I'm only one individual, but certainly I try to make my voice count as much as possible. And I think your points were very valid. I welcome them, and that's something I definitely will focus on and zero on in terms of my sequel to this book, which hopefully my wife's like, nah, don't write that no time soon. Hopefully in the next couple of years. But I love it. I love the tough questions. I think that's how you grow. You got to be able to deal with tough questions. And I think it starts at a very early age at a grassroots level. I think the thing that's amazing, I was a corporate finance major here, but I never learned anything about personal finance. I never learned anything about finance. I never learned anything about that until I became a certified financial planner, which was pretty amazing, and that they have classes, but it should be mandatory.
Yes,
It shouldn't be optional
no
for
matter what their
everybody.
major.
Yes.
Other questions? We have about 5 minutes left, so now's the time to ask them. Yes.
My apologies for not being able to get here on time.
No,
but
that's
I
quite
do-
all right.
I do have a
We're glad you're here at all.
One of the challenges that I see in the larger social context doesn't really have to do with any particular individual group, athletes, entertainers, whatever. It has to do with a fundamental educational flaw that seems to emerge from incapacity for training and teaching character,
Yeah.
moral and ethical standards,
Yeah.
spiritual development. And
Absolutely.
So now we're in a situation where we have leadership that is totally unconnected from the kinds of role models I would want for my children. So it's very difficult to think about, okay, these disadvantaged people needing role models, and then the kind of images and what they're hearing and seeing on the national, if not global scope. So I guess my question really has to do with what can be put in place, not at the child's level, but at the adult level for moral and educational development, spiritual development and training.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can only take someone to your current level of standing, right? So if you got dysfunction, you're just going to manifest that with the younger generation. And that was something that I discussed earlier, is about the values. There's a lack of values. And when you don't understand your values, then you're caught up in the whims of emotions. And obviously we see that that's very destructive today. I said that we need to get back to some old school principles. Old school principles grinded out in terms of values. What's really important? And I think our young people, they're very disconnected spiritually. I said our churches have neglected a lot there. And we allow our culture to shape and dictate how kids should behave. And that's very destructive when you're a growing mind. So I'm very troubled by where our society is, and I think you have to do some tutorials with the people who are actually teaching our kids. And many of them really struggle in a lot of these areas too. So I'm an adult, but I'm still growing. I still fall short of the glory of God. So I want to make sure that I'm growing, but I'm willing to change. I think that's the big key. Be willing to change.
That's my research interest. Are you aware of any institutions or organizations in place now that would market or target adults around this issue?
That's a good one. You got to let me ponder that and contemplate that. That's a good question. So,
I'll say.
Hi, I'm Austin P. I'm a professor in the School of Communication, and this is kind of related to the question I was just posed. It deals with the issue of values. In particular, and you may have covered this already, and I apologize if I missed it, I came in a little late, but the issue of immediate versus delayed gratification.
that's a good one.
It seems like in
That
our
is a good one.
society, particularly in the inner cities, there's a sense that these young kids
Mm-hmm.
are socialized
Mm-hmm.
to engage in immediate gratification.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's, and I grew up in Long Beach, California, in a poverty-stricken environment where this is what everyone wanted money now.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted things now, and they weren't willing to take the time,
Mm-hmm.
follow a program that would allow them on the back end to grow, to nourish, to be financially sound, but not willing to take the time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question to you is, someone like, for kids who are struggling with this socialization process, we see it not only directly in our inner city communities, but also social media and music, and as a television, as a media scholar, you see it in the media all the time,
Mm-hmm.
that it's about immediate gratification. What do you say to young kids, parents, to scholars in terms of reshaping, readjusting those values, those perspectives, where that young kids are shifting, moving away from immediate gratification and trying to help them see what's at the end of the rainbow if
Mhm.
they take their time, follow a good plan
Right.
in terms of delayed gratification. And I suspect your book probably highlights some of these issues more, whether directly
Right.
or indirectly, about delayed gratification. But I suspect that's what financial planning is.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, I always say that you touched upon it, being able to see, and I think particularly for the generation today, everything's instantaneous right now. I need it right now. And for us, what we do, and my wife and I, we created our own platform in terms of financial life skills, and we have apps. And I always say you got to put people in situations just like when you play sports. In order to understand how to respond in a game, you need to be put in that situation. You need to practice it, right? So when you're telling kids values, delayed gratification, that's too abstract. You got to put them in situations so when they go through and they see, oh, if I buy this right now, think about how this is going to impact me. But again, there has to be some type of simulation you put them in because their world is kind of a virtual world, right? So abstract can be a little bit overwhelming to them. They got to experience it. Sensory learning is today's young people, whether they're black or white, inner city, wealthy. I mean, that's kind of how they learn. So delayed gratification, I always say, particularly young people, especially this generation, I mean, they want little sound bites on what it takes to be an investment success, right? They want 30 minutes or 10 minutes or 5 minutes. No, it's a process. Wealth is a process. Character is a process, right? And you have to go through that process in order to grow and to get that outcome. And I think delayed gratification is something certainly we're missing in our society. And the only way you learn that, obviously, is you got to be put in situations where you're forced to. If you're not forced to learn it, you're never going to get it. You're never going to get it. It's a great question. And then Professor Blackwell, one of my professors, thank you. I know I had one of your classes. I always wanted to acknowledge you. I know many others who are here who've supported me. Dave, thank you for coming out, supporting us. Buckeyes, go Bucks. You guys know our basketball team, we've been playing really well, right? Let's give a hand for our basketball team. Come on, the Bucks, yeah. Coach Holtman has done an outstanding job. The guys are playing with fire and drive, and I love it. I love watching these guys play. It's really fun watching them. It's very fun.
Absolutely.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.